kings and queens. Welcome back to another episode of Faith Helps Podcast, and yours truly is here with you again, your host, Diamond Booth, Lemois. I don't know about y'all, but I am very grateful that today is Thursday. I am really just ready for the weekend. I'm ready to rest. I'm ready to do the things that pour back into my cup after pouring into other people's cup all this week. So I hope that you guys are hanging in there. I hope that you guys are doing well, and I hope that you guys are definitely remembering to take care of yourself as well. So without further ado, as you see, today's title is called Blinded by Familiarity, and I actually want to take two spins with this. All of us know, or majority of us have probably heard the song of "Allow Me to Reintroduce Myself. My name is Hope." Yeah, right? Okay. And I think sometimes we glamorize this idea of like reintroducing ourselves, which I am a huge supporter of, because I think there are seasons where we need to reintroduce ourselves to others and those around. But I also think that sometimes we skip the step of the role that familiarity, both perceived familiarity by others and our own perceived familiarity, can play in that process of not only reintroducing yourself and reinventing yourself, but also how it can be harmful when we are on the other end of that. So the first part that I want to kind of talk about with you guys is when you're too familiar, when you have become so comfortable with certain things or situations or people that you've become a bit more lax than maybe you should be. What does this look like? This looks like jumping into a new endeavor or a new skill and feeling like, oh, I've seen this before, I've done this before, I got this, I can make this a full-fledged, business plan. And I think the reason why business has been coming up a lot for me right now is because that's the place and space that I'm in. And so I've had to learn to humble myself and acknowledge when there are things that maybe I'm familiar with it, but I haven't learned it in this area, or I haven't mastered it in this sense or skill set of my life, right? So to be a little bit more clear and specific, when you are too familiar with something, sometimes you can underestimate or overestimate how well you can accomplish it and how much work it's going to require of you. Whenever you're learning something new, or whenever you are taking on a task, it's good to stay curious. I don't care how good you feel about it or how confident you think you are in it. It's good to remain open to feedback. It's good to remain open for critique. And of course, being mindful of who's giving you the critique, because sometimes it's just haters. Other times it's people who actually care about you and are genuinely trying to support you and build to you and add to you because they have expertise in a certain area. So it can be really important for us to be able to take those moments and say, let me take a step back and assess, right? For example, something that used to always come up for me with my parents is because they feel as though they're so familiar with me and they know me, they think that they already have the answer to whatever I bring to them. And sometimes that's not the case, right? Sometimes we feel like we know somebody so well that we just jump to assumptions and conclusions. Or I know, for example, I know my friend, she's always fallen in love too fast. And so you dismiss any time she's bringing a new relationship to you, or when she's bringing up like, man, I feel like this is the one. You're dismissing it before even hearing her out. And it's because you're familiar with that pattern, but you haven't actually taken the moment to take a step back and ask for God's discernment, but also to hear her out or him out, right? So it's important for us to be careful with this idea of familiarity and being comfortable. Sometimes when we're too comfortable, we start to make assumptions that can actually be pretty hurtful. Or we can end up putting our own foot in our mouth because we say something that's out of line or out of pocket. So I think it's important, especially when you're in a career or work environment, to be mindful to not get too comfortable with your familiarity. Just because you and your boss hang out in the afternoons and you guys have a few drinks and you're cool or whatever, don't become so comfortable with that familiarity that you start to lose who you are and your character, and you start allowing yourself to compromise your character and lose your professionalism, right? Because that's when we make mistakes. That's when our actions and the things we say and do come around to kind of bite us in the butt. And so I think it's really essential for us to always be curious whenever we are encountering something or taking on, whether it be a task, a relationship, whatever it might be. Remain curious, right? So I'm wondering for you guys, if you take a moment to think about what are some things that maybe you've jumped straight into that you wish you had slowed down and got a little bit more acquainted with, been a little bit more open to feedback with, been a little bit more humble about before taking that on, or before jumping to an assumption and making a statement that actually probably might not be accurate. I'm sure we all can think of at least one instance. I'm sure all of us can think at least of one time where you thought you knew something, or you thought that you were right, and then later you realize, oh, I was actually really wrong, and I kind of jumped the gun with that one, right? My encouragement to you is, because it's difficult, I want to acknowledge it's really difficult to shift our focus to, yeah, I feel like I know this, I feel like I've seen this before, but let me actually slow down, and just out of abundance of caution, take my time. You never know what you might realize or see when you actually slow down. Think about this, just as a way to kind of practice this practically. The next time you're driving to a familiar place, like let's say your job or home, you're driving home, take at least 20 seconds to slow down and stop at one point in that drive and acknowledge what's around you. I guarantee you're going to see things that you never even realized were there, because the drive home has become so familiar to you. It's routine. You do it all the time. And so you're missing so much. And a lot of times that's how God speaks to us, is when we slow down, that's when we see God. A lot of people kind of struggle with this aspect of, I'm not hearing from God, I'm not hearing from God, I've been praying and praying and praying. Well, maybe you've become too familiar with praying and you're not familiar enough with waiting and listening. Maybe your relationship with God is all one directional. You're constantly saying and praying because that's what you grew up on and that's what you learned, but you haven't practiced stillness. You haven't practiced quietness and slowing down and seeing, okay, what happens when I slow myself down, when I slow my thoughts down, and I'm just still and I'm quiet. We say that all the time, like, be still. And we quote the scripture, be still and know that He is God. But are you actually doing it? And not just 20 seconds of, all right, I didn't get an answer. No, it's a practice. And breaking yourself out of this pattern, of your routine pattern of just being familiar with things, takes practice. It takes discomfort. The first few times, if you're not used to it, sitting in stillness and quietness can feel incredibly uncomfortable and confusing, because a lot of times what happens with people is when they do give themselves those opportunities to have those quiet, still moments, the quietness feels extremely loud, or their thoughts become more, they become more aware of their thoughts and their racing thoughts, and it feels overwhelming because all these things are coming to your mind and you're thinking about what you need to do next, and you can't focus and you feel anxious and overwhelmed. It's because you haven't trained your brain to slow down. That's one of the first things I teach in therapy, is how to slow yourself down when you're struggling with anxiety, stress. A lot of things require us to just slow down, and it's going to be uncomfortable the first few times that you try it, and that's okay. That's where the change and the growth happens. Change happens when you allow yourself to sit with the tension of discomfort, and you allow yourself to wrestle with what is making me uncomfortable in this moment. Why do I not like this right now? What is it triggering or bringing up for me? That's where you actually start making the difference. So that's one of the first things I start with, and that's one of the things I'm going to challenge you to do this weekend. Challenge yourself to do something that makes you uncomfortable. Challenge yourself to practice being more still and quiet. Challenge yourself to slow down a bit and actually take in what's happening around you. One of the posts that, if you follow me on Instagram, I put up a post of, there's these two pictures. In the background, there are the leaves that are waving and flowing, and in the front part of the picture, it's a still frame of that same image of the leaves moving, but it's not moving. And at the bottom it says, live in the moment. I feel like so often, too often, we're taking pictures of things and we are not taking a moment to actually live in the presence of what's happening. We're not taking a moment to be still and observe. And part of the reason why I think that a lot of times we don't slow ourselves down and observe what's happening is because we're so familiar with it, right? If you think about your house, you probably feel really familiar with the house. You could probably turn the lights off at night and walk around your house without bumping into things because you are pretty familiar with where things are. Maybe you might step on a shoe or a toy that someone left lying around, but for the most part, you're familiar with your home. I want to also challenge you to slow down and really observe certain things. All things go through natural wear and tear that we probably don't even observe majority of the time. Just like your body and just like your mind. You yourself are probably so familiar with yourself that you don't even realize how much stuff you're missing and overlooking. You're just so used to going to the next thing, and you don't pay attention to what's actually happening inside of you and what you're feeling. And the moment that you challenge yourself to actually slow down and pay attention to what you're feeling, you learn so much more. You create access to healing. You create access to new strength that you didn't even know was there. You also can be a bit more proactive about preventing certain like injuries or ailments. A lot of times once we practice those moments of like doing like what's called a body scan, which is just taking observation of how you're feeling in your body. How are your muscles feeling? What sensations are you noticing? And allowing yourself to be mindful of that. And it can draw your attention to what's happening that maybe you've been dismissing because life has been so routine. Your body is so routine. You just go to the next thing. This is why a lot of times doctors are like, man, if you had just came in a year ago, we could have resolved this issue and we could have prevented X, Y, and Z. But sometimes we're so familiar with certain things that we take for granted that our body is going through change, our mind is going through change, our life is experiencing so many changes, but we're so stuck in the routine and familiarity of it that we don't slow down to really assess what's happening in our life and how it's impacting us or how it's influencing and changing us, right? So that was one side of it. And then the other side, which I feel like is the part that everyone likes talking about, is the let me reintroduce myself when people are too familiar with you. And that can be great when you are really proud of the changes that you made and how you're growing and how you're transforming. That is amazing. And it can be very easy to be pulled back into that old version of yourself. I think a lot of times, first starting off, whenever you're reinventing yourself and you're making certain changes for yourself, we're very ambitious and we're very confident, and we underestimate the power of familiarity that other people have with us. It's not always going to be easy to say, I know every single weekend we went to that club, but I'm actually not on that no more. I know that sometimes it can be really hard to have that conversation of, I actually don't engage in that behavior anymore, or I don't engage in that habit anymore. And no, it's not me looking at you any type of way. It's just what I need for myself. This is something that I'm stopping. For example, when I decided to stop smoking and I decided to stop eating edibles, I really struggled with the fact that I was like, people gonna be looking at me a certain way. And I wasn't even a big smoker, but edibles, yeah, guilty as charged. And it was kind of like just like, oh, we just, hanging out, we doing this, da 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 da. And when I had to first have that conversation of actually, I'm not anymore, because people were familiar with that side of me and that version of me, it was, so why? Or what's the issue? Or, well, I'm not doing it. And I'm like, you don't have to. I'm not asking you to stop. I'm saying for me, and what I feel like God has been working on me in, and what I've realized is honestly just better for my mental, emotional, physical, spiritual health, this is the decision I'm making. And sometimes people can handle that, sometimes people won't. And I see what happens a lot of times when I'm helping my clients through certain transitions is the thing that always brings them back to stagnation or back to a version of themselves that they're trying to leave behind is the people who are familiar with that version of themselves, because they know what to say to pull that version of you out. For example, if you're someone who's known to be the 0 to 100 friend, and you're known to be that angry friend or that friend who is always going to turn up and ready to fight, they know to hype you up because that's the version that they like. That's the version that they're familiar with. That's the role you played in their life. And so there are going to be triggers that sometimes you're like, I know that I'm wanting to step into this more peaceful, patient version of myself. I know that I feel like I'm being called and pulled to be slow to speak. And I know that I don't want to be known to be the pop-off friend anymore. But also, man, this is what I actually would say if I could. And this is what I would actually do. And then you start thinking about it. And it always starts with your thoughts. You're starting to think about, like, if I did respond, I would say this. Or if I did, I would pull up this way. And then once your thoughts go there, your emotions, your behaviors, everything else starts to follow. And so it's important to kind of be aware of people who are familiar and with that version, those past versions of yourself, and how to pull away from that and distance yourself as needed. Sometimes people are so blinded by the fact that you have changed that all they see is who they knew you as, and they are completely missing who you are becoming. And becoming is a scary thing. Becoming is a frustrating thing, because when you are becoming this new version of yourself, you're going to be challenged. And from a spiritual perspective, the enemy knows what you like. He knows what gets your flesh. He knows what entices you. And so there are going to be people, whether intentional or not, who are going to speak and draw out that version of you. It's your job to be aware, to be mindful, and to set boundaries. I had to put a very short leash on myself. I knew there are some places I can't go and some people I can't hang out with, because they're going to pull out a side of me or trigger or entice a side of me that I don't want to see anymore, and I don't want to be around that anymore, and I'm not that anymore. And it's honestly just not good for my mental, emotional, physical health, right? So what I would encourage you to do, if you are finding yourself in this situation where you're reinventing yourself and you are trying to step into this new version of yourself, but everyone is looking at you from who they knew you to be, and they're familiar with that side of you, I think number one, being clear of stating what your boundaries are, what changes that you are making and what you're working on. And no, you don't have to broadcast it every single time. But when the conversation comes up, you have to be bold and brave enough to have it. Otherwise, you're going to keep allowing these loopholes to be formed and putting yourself in situations where you're going to be tempted to slip back into old ways and old habits. I think for those on the other end of that, when you are seeing a friend go through some changes and you aren't seeing the version of them that you're familiar with, don't be blinded by your familiarity. Like, pull back the veil of who you used to see them as and be open and be curious about who they are becoming. And before you speak on it, I feel like particularly when it comes to Christians, sometimes we can be holier than thou. Sometimes we always think we know something. Shut up for a second with so much love and be quiet. And before you say anything to that person about who they are becoming and who they are changing and what they're changing about themselves, ask God, has He released you to say anything to them? Ask God and pray to God about them before you open up your mouth and potentially kill something that God is trying to grow and develop within them. All right? Good intentions or not, sometimes we get it wrong. There have been plenty of times where I was like, oh no girl, don't do that, or bruh, that's not a good idea. And later on down the line, I see how God was working in them and why God brought them through certain things. And I'm like, dang, I was almost a stumbling block. So I had to check myself. So I invite you to also check yourself when you're seeing the people in your environment or that you're connected to starting to change. Check yourself, check your emotions. What is it triggering you? Maybe you are struggling with the fact that they're changing because maybe what they're changing is something that you're supposed to be working on, and vice versa. So be curious. Be curious. You know, they say that sight is like one of the most important senses because it helps us as far as safety. We see danger, we can see and assess situations. I would also say that we have other senses for a reason. Use all of your senses when you are assessing, whether it be a situation or a relationship in your life. How are you not just viewing them, whether it be spiritually viewing them or viewing them actually, like in the physical light, what you're seeing them do and whatnot, but also what are you hearing? And not just the words that they're saying, but the way that they're saying, the context that's being said. When you hear them speaking, what is it igniting in you? What are some of those sensations that you feel in your body? A lot of times we focus on the emotions, sadness, happiness, fear, or anxiety, those sorts of things. But what are you feeling in your body? Is your heart skipping a beat? Do you feel tension in your shoulders or in your back? Or maybe you feel uneasy or nauseous. A lot of things through language trigger certain sensations in our body that we can bypass very easy because we're so familiar with just going based off of face value of what someone's saying. But when you slow down, you're actually listening to what people say. I think sometimes that's the advantage of being one of my audio viewers, is because you just hear what's being said and you actually digest so much more than being distracted by the dinosaurs in the background or the light of the mic changing colors or how I'm saying things. And also I tend to move my hands a lot. All that can be so distracting from what I'm actually saying. And so if you are one of my viewers on YouTube, I challenge you one day, try listening to me on just Spotify or Apple Podcasts and just listening instead of watching, and see the difference of what you take in versus when you're just watching it. And then I think a lot of times we feel so much, not just within our body, but also we can feel how our emotions are moving through our body. But all of these are things that we can't really take awareness of unless we slow down and we become more curious about what's happening and become more curious about the situation or the relationship or whatever it is that you're encountering. So my hope for you guys this week is that you will challenge yourself to be curious. Challenge yourself to step out of your familiarity with someone or something or a situation and take a notice of what's actually happening. And for those of you who are reinventing yourself, be patient with yourself. It's not going to happen overnight. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to be challenged. You're going to want to go back to the things that you used to do. You're going to want to not do the things that you know you should be doing. It's okay. Wrestle with it. Normalize wrestling with things. It's okay, because that's when the change actually happens, because you're taking notice of what you're feeling. And when you're more aware of what you're feeling, you'll know better how to address them and handle them and manage them. And you also realize that a lot of these feelings that we have are fleeting. You can be anxious for a few minutes, and then you realize, once I allowed myself to wrestle with it and I allowed myself to kind of sit with it for a minute, I don't feel so anxious. And then you're able to move on. Give yourself the grace to experience that. Alright? So, if nothing else, I hope that you guys walk away with these 3 things. Number 1, do not be blinded with familiarity. Stay curious about whatever situation, whatever endeavor that you are taking on, whatever project that you're beginning. Stay curious. When it comes to relationships, number 2, be mindful to check within yourself of what someone else's change is triggering in you, and be slow to speak on what they're changing. Pray about it before you drop your 2 cents, and maybe don't drop your 2 cents at all, right? If you're concerned, lift it up to the Lord. And then number 3, when you are the one who is changing, and when you are the one that's trying to reintroduce yourself, be patient with yourself. Set strict boundaries. Keep yourself on a short leash so that you don't find yourself backsliding into things that you don't want to do, or the version of yourself that you don't want to be anymore. And if nothing else, I hope you guys continue to grow, continue to challenge yourself to do the new and uncomfortable things. And if nothing else, remember to love others, love God, love yourself, and take time this weekend to really pour back into your cup and to nurture yourself and to grow in whatever area of your life that you're working on this week. All right? Peace out.